I picked up the phone and called my cheating wife's lover, knowing they were together. A mix of anger and resentment washed over me. The words came out sharp, controlled, "Tell her I'm filing for divorce." I could hear their breathing on the other end, the heavy silence of someone caught off guard, unsure of what to say, but the decision was final. There was no turning back. She made attempts, called me, sent messages. He tried to defend the indefensible. But what more could I say? What could I hear that would undo the fact that, in that moment, love was dead? The late nights she'd come home, the smiles she no longer gave me, the weak excuses, it all clicked now. I always knew this day would come, but I never expected it to hit this hard. So sudden. So final. The party was at a mutual friend's place. She had no clue I'd be there, and even less idea that it would be the last time we'd see each other as husband and wife. I walked in, determined. The pounding music, the laughter, the bright lights flashing around, it was all a cruel contrast to the emptiness I felt inside. I moved through the crowd, ignoring the chatter, the curious stares. I just needed to reach her. Both of them. I saw them before they noticed me. Together, laughing, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. It burned deep. That was my wife, the woman I'd vowed to share my life with. How could she? And him, just a bystander, an insignificant player who had no idea what was coming. As I got closer, it felt like everything slowed down. I saw them, every smile, every gesture, all in slow motion, and what stung the most was the lack of guilt on her face. There was no shame. As if what they were doing had no consequences. But there would be consequences. "I'm divorcing her," I said, my voice cold and steady, leaving no room for doubt. I watched her freeze in place. The smile vanished from her lips, as if it had never been there. Her eyes widened in shock, and panic crept in. What are you doing here?" she stammered, her face turning pale, her expression bewildered. I stayed quiet, letting her try to process what was happening. His hand was still on her arm, a touch that might have seemed casual once, but now reeked of guilt. She pulled away slightly, but he stayed put, lost, unsure of what to do. "Wait, let me explain. It's not what you think," she blurted out, her voice trembling, the words coming fast, desperate. But there was nothing to explain. There was no excuse that could mend what had already been shattered. What do you do when the world you thought you knew crumbles right before your eyes? When the person you trusted the most betrays you? I didn't want to shout. I didn't want to break down. I wanted her to understand the weight of what she had done. I wanted her to feel the same void that now consumed me. She kept talking, her words tripping over each other, but none of it mattered. I wasn't listening anymore, I was just watching. The fear in her eyes. The way she scrambled to justify the unjustifiable. The way he stared at me, clueless, at a loss for words. A heavy silence settled between the three of us. He looked at her, expecting her to fix it somehow, but she was lost. "Let me explain," she repeated, as if there was still something to say. I nodded slowly. But there were no more explanations left to give. There were no more excuses left. All that remained now was the finality of it all, and I wanted her to feel every bit of the pain that came with it. "There's nothing to explain," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the air. "I know everything already." She tried to move closer, her eyes filling with tears, but they wouldn't change a thing. Those tears felt as fake to me as the flimsy excuses she was trying to piece together. "Please. I made a mistake. I can fix this, we can fix this," she stammered, her voice trembling, and for the first time, I saw her grasping the weight of the situation. But it was far too late for that. I had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering what I had done wrong, where I had fallen short. I replayed every moment, every little gesture, trying to pinpoint my failure. But now I understood, it wasn't my fault. And that realization gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't expected. She couldn't stop talking, her words spilling out in a desperate attempt to rewrite the past, to undo the future she had chosen for us. But what more could she say? What could I hear that would change the fact that the love we once shared was now dead? Nothing. My decision had already been made, and that was the only certainty left. As she spiraled deeper into her panic, it hit me, none of this was about what she said anymore. It wasn't even about her feelings. What mattered now was how I felt. And the truth was, I didn't feel a thing anymore. The emptiness had swallowed up everything. She looked at me, hoping for a response, for a glimmer of hope. But the man she knew, the one who loved her and would have done anything for her, was gone. In his place was someone who knew exactly what he wanted, and what I wanted was my freedom. When you reach the point where you feel nothing at all, there's nothing left to keep you hanging on. No reason to stay. And I had reached that point. The moment when words lose all meaning and silence is the only answer left. Without another word, I turned and left the party, leaving her there with her explanations, her regrets, and her empty promises. She was lost in a world of her own making. And me? I was free. But what she didn't realize was that this divorce wasn't just going to be the end of our marriage. There was something bigger coming, something she hadn't even begun to understand. Soon enough, she'd learn that the world she thought she knew was about to come crashing down. What would she do when she realized that the real fear wasn't just losing her marriage, but losing everything she had built? Welcome to the channel, where we stand firmly against any form of cheating. The stories you're about to hear are fictional, but they paint a clear picture of how betrayal destroys lives, families, and trust. Buckle up, because what's coming is an intense, emotional journey that'll stir something inside you. Get ready for a dramatic and eye-opening ride. The clock on the wall read 7 p.m., but time felt like it was moving painfully slow. David sat on the couch in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, his mind miles away. The house, once filled with love and happiness, now felt like an empty shell. The silence was almost unbearable. The TV was on, but he barely noticed the flickering images on the screen. His mind was lost in memories of better days, days that had slipped through his fingers like sand. Elizabeth, his wife, had left early that morning, just like she had every day for the past few months. Lately, she had grown more and more distant. The warm hugs, the quick kisses before work, the easy conversations at the dinner table, they all felt like they belonged to another time, a distant past. David couldn't help but remember how she used to wait for him at the door when he got home after a long day at work. There was something soothing about their old routine, the comfort of always having her there, waiting for him. But recently, Elizabeth had become someone he hardly knew anymore. He still remembered the first time they met. She was the most stunning woman he'd ever laid eyes on, with a contagious energy and a spirit so light it captivated everyone around her. Their laughter used to echo in the bars they'd go dancing at in the city. David would always say she lit up every room she stepped into. His friends often teased him about how lucky he was to have her, and he believed it wholeheartedly. With Elizabeth, he felt like the luckiest man alive. In the beginning, being married to her was everything he had dreamed of. They built a life together, weathering any storm that came their way. Elizabeth was his partner through it all. They shared their dreams, their plans, and their ambitions. They spoke of having children, traveling the world, and growing old together. And for many years, it seemed like they were well on their way to making all of that a reality. But, over time, small cracks began to form. Nothing big at first, just little changes. Elizabeth started working more, staying out late, always explaining it away with her new job responsibilities. David wanted to believe it was just the stress of work. He, too, spent long hours at the office, trying to grow his business. They had always been a strong team, capable of handling anything. But something had shifted, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Elizabeth seemed more distant, less animated about the things that used to light her up. She didn't talk about her day with the same enthusiasm anymore, and when David tried to get closer, she would simply withdraw. The easy intimacy they once had was gone, along with the effortless conversations. Now, every word felt like a struggle, and the space between them was becoming impossible to ignore. That evening, as he stared into his whiskey glass, David felt a heavy weight pressing on his chest. He wanted to believe this was just a rough patch. Marriages had their ups and downs, didn't they? At least, that's what everyone said. But deep inside, he knew something was seriously wrong. The worst part was the helplessness, the uncertainty of how to fix what was broken. Outside, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway signaled Elizabeth's return. David glanced at the door, waiting for the familiar sound of her key turning in the lock. She entered the room briskly, removing her coat and tossing her bag onto the sofa. Their eyes met briefly in a routine, emotionless greeting, a simple, automatic, hi, like they were just two strangers under the same roof. "How was your day?" David asked, trying to keep his voice casual, even though the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Tiring," Elizabeth replied without looking at him, already heading toward the kitchen. That short answer had become her new norm. It was always the same thing. David wondered if she even realized how far she had drifted from him. Or maybe she did, and just didn't care anymore. It was hard to know what was going through Elizabeth's mind, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. That night, he chose not to push for more. He didn't want to pressure her, not then. They sat at the table, eating dinner in silence, just like they had been doing for months. The words that should have filled the air between them were replaced by the clinking of silverware and the creaking of chairs. David stole glances at Elizabeth, searching for a glimpse of the woman he had once fallen so deeply in love with. She was sitting right there, but somehow, she was a million miles away. And it was that invisible distance that hurt him the most. After dinner, Elizabeth retreated to her room, like she always did. David stayed in the living room a little longer, lost in his thoughts. He knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, but what was the alternative? Facing the truth felt like a road too painful to walk. He still loved Elizabeth, but it seemed love alone wasn't enough to bridge the gap between them anymore. As the minutes ticked by, he began second-guessing his choices. Could it have been his job, the long hours he put into the company, that had kept them apart? Had he missed the warning signs that something wasn't right? Doubts swirled like a storm in his mind, and he felt utterly powerless against the growing distance between them. On the other side of the house, Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror, lost in her own thoughts. Her reflection stared back at her, a mix of exhaustion and uncertainty in her eyes. She knew David was trying, she could see that he still cared. But there was a wall between them now, one she didn't know how to climb anymore. Sometimes, she wondered if she had changed or if the world around her had. Once, she had loved David with all her heart. She still felt something for him, something deep. But over time, that love had shifted, diluted into something she couldn't quite define. Maybe it was the weight of expectations, the responsibilities that had piled up over the years. Maybe it was the demands of her job, which consumed more and more of her. Or maybe it was just her, a different woman than the one David had fallen for. The truth was, whenever she lay next to him at night, the distance between them felt unbridgeable, a silence no words could fix. And in that quiet, lonely space, she began to question her own decisions. Elizabeth knew David deserved more, but at the same time, she didn't think she had it in her to give him what he needed anymore. As the silence crept through the house, they were both locked in their own emotional battles, unaware that the fate of their relationship was on the verge of being decided. Whatever was coming would change everything, but for now, the only thing they both knew for certain was the uncertainty of their future. And in that uncertainty, in the growing void between them, something was about to surface, something neither of them was prepared to face. The next day began like any other. David woke up early, as usual, but the heaviness in his chest wasn't like before. Something was gnawing at him, something he could no longer push aside. Elizabeth had already left the house before him, as she had been doing for the past few weeks, her parting words barely a casual, "See you later," echoing through the emptiness. Their quiet, distant routine had become so deeply ingrained that it was almost unbearable. David realized he couldn't continue living with that hollow feeling. The distance between them no longer made sense, and he was tired of wondering where it all went wrong. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was truly happening to his wife. The silence between them wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unsettling. This wasn't just a phase, and it wasn't just work stress. There was something more, something he hadn't yet put his finger on, but he felt it creeping closer to the surface. At work, David tried to focus on his tasks, but every time his phone buzzed, he found himself hoping it was Elizabeth. Maybe she'd noticed the widening gap. Maybe she wanted to talk, to fix things. But the reality was always the same: work emails, meeting reminders, empty routine messages that did nothing to fill the emotional void. He spent hours staring at his computer screen, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. And that's when it hit him: something had been nagging at him for days, something he couldn't shake. The message from the detective David had impulsively hired to follow Elizabeth had been sitting on his phone since earlier that day, but he hadn't summoned the courage to listen to it. The phone lay there on the table, almost taunting him, reminding him that with just the press of a button, everything he thought he knew about his life could change. Deep down, David understood that listening to that message was the first step toward a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But with a heavy heart, he finally hit play. The detective's voice came through, firm and direct, with no hesitation. "Sir, I have the information you requested. I suggest you take a look at the images I've sent as attachments. Your wife has been taking time off work to meet with a man at various locations, and there's little doubt about the nature of their relationship." The words cut deep, like a blade slicing through his chest. David froze, struggling to process what he had just heard. He had known for some time that something was off, but this was more than just a suspicion. This was cold, hard proof, and the pain that came with it was overwhelming. His hands trembled as he opened the attachments. The images were clear as day. There was Elizabeth, leaving a restaurant, laughing and leaning in close to another man. They touched, exchanged intimate glances, gestures David hadn't seen from her in months. She was cheating. There was no denying it now. It felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? His blood raced, a mix of rage and despair building inside him. But beneath all that, he felt something even worse: humiliation. While he had been agonizing over the future of their marriage, Elizabeth had already moved on, living a separate life, one where he no longer had a place. He abruptly left the office, not bothering to give any explanation to his coworkers. As he drove home, his mind buzzed with 1,000 questions and scenarios. Why had she done this? What did this other man have that he didn't? Memories of the good times they had shared, of the promises they made to each other, flashed in his mind like scenes from a distant movie, now tainted, almost like a lie. He had poured so much of himself into their marriage. And now, it all felt like it was falling apart, breaking into pieces. When David returned to their empty house, he sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into the distance. The ticking of the clock echoed through the silence. The anger that had consumed him earlier turned into something colder, more controlled. He knew he had to do something, but part of him still hesitated. Should he confront her directly? Should he wait for her to come clean? Doubts gnawed at his mind, but one thing was clear: he needed to see her, to look into her eyes and confirm the truth he already felt in his gut. That night, Elizabeth didn't come home at her usual time. David knew exactly where she was. The photos, the meetings, the pattern was all too familiar now. Without really thinking about it, he picked up the phone and dialed her lover. There was a morbid curiosity in him, a need to hear it for himself, to know what they were doing when he wasn't around. "Hello." The man's voice on the other end sounded startled. David stayed silent for a moment, but when he spoke, his words were firm, unshakable. "Tell her I'm getting a divorce." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. David could imagine the shock on their faces, could picture Elizabeth's pale, stunned expression. There was no going back now. The betrayal had been uncovered, and everything they had built together, the plans, the dreams, felt like nothing more than a fragile house of cards, about to come crashing down. Without waiting for a response, David hung up. He knew Elizabeth would try to call him, try to explain herself, but he didn't want to hear it. Not now. Not after everything. Explanations wouldn't change the fact that she had already made her decision. The pain in his chest was almost unbearable, but alongside it, a strange sense of relief was beginning to surface. No longer was he stuck in that web of doubt and suspicion. The betrayal had come to light, and now all that remained was dealing with the fallout. But there was still something Elizabeth didn't know. Something David had been planning, something that went far beyond just filing for divorce. David sat on the couch, his mind racing after the call he had made to her lover. The silence in the house was thick, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Elizabeth would be home soon, probably frantic, desperate to fix what couldn't be mended. The affair had been exposed, but there was more to the story, something even bigger that she had yet to discover. Something that would make the current moment pale in comparison to what was coming next. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, and soon Elizabeth's hurried footsteps followed. She entered the room, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with fear. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, her expression a mix of terror and desperation. David sat still, his gaze locked on her. She stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, unsure whether to approach him or stay where she was. "David, please," her voice was soft, almost pleading. "Listen to me. I can explain." He didn't respond. His stare remained cold and distant. Elizabeth took a few hesitant steps forward, her hands trembling as she tried to find the right words to ease the tension. I made a mistake," she stammered, her voice shaking. "I don't know where to begin, but you have to understand. I was lost. We were drifting apart, and I didn't know what to do. Please, just hear me out." Tears started to stream down her face, but David remained unmoved. She kept talking, the words spilling out in a rush, but he had already tuned her out. The apologies sounded like nothing more than background noise, unable to break through the wall he had built around himself. For so long, he had blamed himself, wondering where he had gone wrong. But now, everything was clear. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. "This isn't about us, Elizabeth." His voice finally broke the silence, sharp and cold like a blade. "This is about you. About the choices you made." She stopped, her desperate expression freezing, as if she had run straight into a brick wall. "I know I hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I love you. I still love you." Her voice grew more frantic, thick with desperation. "We can fix this, David. We can fix everything." "Fix what?" David shot to his feet, the anger he had been holding back finally boiling over. "You betrayed me, Elizabeth. This wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. A decision you made over and over again while I was here, trying to save something you had already destroyed." "No," she cried out, her voice filled with panic. "It's not like that. I was confused, but I want to be with you. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I don't love you." David stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. Part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the idea that this was something that could be forgiven, something they could somehow move past. But the other part of him, the rational part, knew the truth: nothing would ever be the same. And worse, Elizabeth still had no clue what was truly at stake. She hadn't yet realized the full depth of the abyss she was standing on the edge of. Do you think love makes this all okay? His voice was steadier now, but it still carried the weight of his bitterness. Do you think we can just sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened? That we can go back to the way things were? David's words hung in the air as Elizabeth stared at him, tears streaming down her face. She was visibly shaken, her breath coming in heavy, uneven bursts, her body trembling with emotion. In that moment, David knew it was time to show her that her betrayal was just the tip of something much deeper. He took a step toward her, the tension in the room almost suffocating, the air thick with everything left unsaid. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, and with a deliberate motion, tossed it onto the coffee table. Elizabeth looked at the phone, confusion clouding her tear-streaked face. What is that?" she asked, her voice barely holding together. David's eyes remained locked on hers, cold and unflinching. "That, Elizabeth, is the evidence. Every photo, every meeting, everything. I knew what you were doing. I hired someone to follow you." His voice was calm, measured, but each word hit her like a dagger. She staggered back, as though physically struck by the weight of his revelation. "David." She began weakly, but he cut her off. "I knew everything. I saw the photos. I know where you've been," he said, his voice thick with a mix of pain and restrained anger. "The lies, the betrayal, you built all of it. And now you stand here, trying to explain yourself, as if that will somehow undo what you've done." Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, her sobs muffled but still audible, as if the reality of her situation was too much to bear. But David wasn't done. He stepped closer, his gaze never wavering, his eyes cold but determined. "And there's more," he said, his tone eerily calm, more chilling than if he had been shouting. "I've made my decisions too, Elizabeth. This won't just be a divorce." She uncovered her face, still trying to comprehend the gravity of his words, confusion etched across her features. What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David moved toward the table, picking up an envelope that had been waiting for this moment. He opened it, pulling out a stack of papers, and dropped them on the table with a thud that seemed to echo through the room. "I transferred all our money into a separate account." "My account," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "You're not getting anything, Elizabeth. I made sure of that." Elizabeth blinked, stunned, her mind struggling to process what he had just told her. "What?" she asked, her voice shaky. "David, no. You can't. You can't do this to me." Her disbelief quickly morphed into desperation. "You can't leave me with nothing." David crossed his arms, watching as Elizabeth's confidence crumbled before him. "I can, and I did," he replied, his tone unwavering. "You destroyed our marriage, Elizabeth. Now, you're going to face the consequences." "No." Elizabeth gasped, throwing herself toward him in a fit of desperation. "David, please. Don't do this. I need you. Her words became frantic, but David didn't budge. He stood firm, unshaken by her pleas. "It's too late for regrets, Elizabeth," he said flatly, devoid of any emotion. "You made your choices. Now, I'm making mine." The weight of his words seemed to crush whatever hope Elizabeth still clung to. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, utterly defeated. The confident woman David had once loved had now been reduced to a broken mess of regret and despair. And while the sight pained him, he knew this was the only way to close this chapter of his life for good. Without another word, David turned and walked away, leaving Elizabeth crumpled on the living room floor. The anger that had consumed him earlier was gone, replaced by a calm sense of closure. All that remained now was the feeling that it was finally over. A sense of freedom washed over David, but it wasn't the victory he'd imagined. It was more a feeling of completion, as if the final chapter of this long, painful story had been written. He knew there was still plenty left to deal with, the divorce, the finances, but for now, he held something Elizabeth never expected: control. Her sobs echoed through the room as David stood there, silent, watching her. He had said everything he needed to say, made the decisions he'd avoided for far too long. The shock and despair etched on her face, the realization that there was nothing left to salvage, confirmed that the path he had chosen was the only one left. But the triumph he thought would come never arrived. Instead, an unsettling emptiness crept in as he looked at the woman who had once been everything to him, now reduced to a fragile figure on the floor, pleading for something that was no longer there. He tried to cling to the anger that had carried him this far, but the fire inside was flickering out, leaving behind only hollow silence. What comes after the destruction of everything? How do you deal with the ruins? Elizabeth, still crying, struggled to form words. Her voice was weak, choked with emotion, but she kept trying. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her eyes swollen, her face streaked with tears. "I know I did everything wrong, but don't leave me like this, David. I can't do this without you. Not like this." She looked up at him, desperately searching for some sign, any glimmer of hope. But David stood motionless, arms crossed, saying nothing. The sound of her sobs filled the room, making the atmosphere so heavy it was almost suffocating. As he watched her, part of him wondered when everything had truly fallen apart. Was it when he discovered her betrayal? Or was it much earlier, when he was still trying to fix things while Elizabeth had already checked out, without him realizing? That question now pounded in his mind, but the answer seemed out of reach. "What do you want me to do, Elizabeth?" he finally asked, his voice weary, drained of the anger that had driven him before. "There's no going back. There's nothing left for me to do." She shook her head, her eyes filled with desperation. "No. It can't end like this. You said you loved me, you said we could get through anything. Remember?" Her voice cracked as her desperation grew. "We can try. I know I messed up, but we can try again. Just give me a chance." David looked at her for a moment, searching for any trace of the woman she used to be. But the truth was, he no longer knew who Elizabeth was. The woman standing before him, broken and pleading, wasn't the same person anymore. And he knew he wasn't the same either. "I did love you, Elizabeth," he said quietly, feeling the weight of the words as they left his mouth. "But love isn't enough to fix this. Not after everything." She shook her head, unwilling to accept the reality. The thought of losing it all seemed to shake her to her core. Her body trembled as she slowly rose from the floor, moving toward him as if the physical act of getting closer could somehow undo what had been done. "David, please, don't leave me like this," she begged, her voice quivering. "I know I made a mistake, but," she reached out to grab his hand, but he took a step back, refusing the contact. "I can't do this with you anymore," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Elizabeth stood there, her eyes pleading, her body trembling with the weight of her desperation. David wanted to believe there was something he could say to soothe the storm inside her, but he knew better. He had spent so much time in silence, trying to hold things together, trying to find ways to save their marriage. But now, standing there in the midst of her tears and pleas, he knew with absolute certainty, there was nothing left to save. "I'm lost too, Elizabeth," David admitted, his voice low and heavy with exhaustion. "I thought if I took control, if I confronted you, it would bring me some kind of peace. But the truth is, I don't know where to go from here. What's left between us isn't enough for both of us." The room fell into silence again as Elizabeth, still catching her breath, stared at David, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. There was no way to undo what had been done. The promises, the plans, everything they had built over the years, had crumbled into ruins. She felt like the ground beneath her was giving way, like she was falling into an abyss with no way out. "And now," she whispered, her voice barely audible, What happens now? David sighed deeply, looking at her with a mix of sadness and resignation. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. The only option left was to move forward, however painful that might be. Now, we move on with our lives. Separately, he said firmly. There's no other choice. Elizabeth closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but this time, she had no words left. Just the sound of their heavy breathing and the emptiness that now filled the space between them. They had reached the point of no return, and as much as it hurt, they both knew this was the only conclusion left. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but silence, the sound of Elizabeth's unsteady breathing, David's restless thoughts, and the soft whistle of the wind outside. Time seemed to slow down, the world shrinking around them. David glanced at the table, at the papers he had shown her. Evidence of the betrayal. Proof that had been necessary to open his eyes to the truth. But now, those papers felt different. They didn't just reveal infidelity, they symbolized the end of something much larger. And at the same time, something smaller. The betrayal, as devastating as it was, wasn't the sole reason for their downfall. It was merely the final drop in a cup that had been overflowing for a long time. I didn't want it to be like this, Elizabeth murmured, staring at the floor. I never wanted it to end this way. David watched her, and in that moment, he believed her. He had no doubt that on some level, she hadn't wanted things to fall apart like this. But the reality was that the choices they both made over the years, the mistakes, the silences, the small daily betrayals, had all led them to this moment. And as much as they might have wished to turn back, there was no way to do so anymore. He took a deep breath, then, with a nearly imperceptible nod, turned and walked toward the door. He knew that if he stayed any longer, the temptation to try and fix something irreparable would be too strong. And he couldn't allow himself to stay trapped in a cycle that had already broken him. With his hand on the doorknob, David paused and turned to look at Elizabeth one last time. She remained standing there, motionless, tears still falling silently down her face. There was nothing left to say. Words no longer held any power. So, he left. The cold night air hit him as he stepped outside, but unlike before, he didn't feel weighed down by it. It felt like, for the first time in a long time, he could actually breathe. Night had fully descended by the time David walked out, leaving Elizabeth behind to her own despair. The biting wind that blew through him seemed to slowly lift the weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long. This was the end of a long journey, a journey marked by pain, betrayal, and silence that had finally reached its conclusion. David drove through the city without a clear destination, letting his thoughts wander. He knew the worst was behind him, but he also knew that true healing was still far off. Elizabeth's betrayal had shattered something inside him, something that wouldn't be easily repaired. But as the cold wind whistled through the car window, he began to feel the faintest stirrings of hope. A new beginning, even if it was a long way off. But there was, undeniably, a sense of freedom that David hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. For the first time in months, maybe even years, he wasn't caught up in the endless struggle to save a marriage that had been doomed for far too long. He parked his car in some random spot, staring out at the emptiness ahead of him. The future felt uncertain, but this time, he knew it would be a future shaped by his own choices. There would be no more weight of doubt or mistrust hanging over him. All that was left now was the road forward, even if it meant walking it alone for a while. As David sat reflecting, Elizabeth remained alone in the house. The silence, once an invisible barrier between them, now felt like a crushing presence. Her tears continued to fall, but as the minutes passed, they lost their intensity. Desperation slowly gave way to an overwhelming emptiness. She knew, deep down, that David wasn't coming back. She knew there would be no forgiveness, no return to what once was. And the painful truth was, Elizabeth couldn't blame him. She slowly stood up from the floor, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. The promises she'd broken, the lies she'd told, and the irreversible damage she'd caused all hit her with a force she had never anticipated. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of her actions, and with that understanding came a pain she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Elizabeth's eyes landed on the documents David had left on the table, papers that clearly spelled out what was coming next. Divorce. The final end of everything. But what terrified her most wasn't the end of the marriage, it was the prospect of starting over, completely alone. The stability and security that David had provided were gone, and the thought of facing life without that foundation left her teetering on the edge of panic. With trembling hands, she tried to collect her thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. What had once felt like an escape, a fleeting release from her dissatisfaction, now stood exposed as the beginning of the end. And now? What was left? She knew David had taken everything, leaving her with no legal ground to stand on. The realization that she was about to face the world without money, without the comfort her marriage had provided, was almost too much to bear. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, David parked in front of a small bar. It was a simple, out-of-the-way place, the kind of spot where he could disappear for a while. He walked in, ordered a drink, and found a quiet corner to sit in, far from prying eyes. As he held the glass in his hand, he thought about everything that had happened. He knew that while there was relief, there were also new challenges waiting ahead. Rebuilding his life without Elizabeth. Dealing with the loneliness. Learning to trust again. But in that moment, he felt at peace with the decisions he'd made. Her betrayal hadn't just broken their marriage, it had shattered the man he had been with her. Now, he had a chance to rediscover who he was. Back at the house, Elizabeth did the only thing that made sense in her mind. She picked up the phone and tried calling her lover. Maybe, in some way, he could be the lifeline she needed, her refuge. But to her dismay, the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again, but the result was the same. It was as if the ground was falling away beneath her once more. The man she had risked everything for wasn't there when she needed him most. As the hours dragged on, Elizabeth was hit with the harsh reality that she was truly alone. The man she had cheated on David with was no solution, he had been nothing more than an illusion. And now, with her husband gone and her lover unreachable, she found herself staring into the void. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, heavier than anything she could bear alone. That same night, David finished his drink and left the bar. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his life. He had the power to choose what came next, and that, in itself, was a huge step forward. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained in the house, sitting alone on the couch, staring blankly into the distance. The future she had imagined for herself had crumbled before her eyes. And now, without David, without her lover, and without the comfort she once relied on, all she was left with was regret. A regret she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. The end had come quietly but devastatingly. David moved forward, free to rebuild his life, while Elizabeth was left to face the consequences of her own choices. She had lost everything, and now, she was left to confront her greatest fear, that sometimes, the price of betrayal is far greater than anyone can pay. And you, what did you think of this story? Leave your comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Here, we stand firmly against any form of cheating, because we believe that honesty and loyalty are the cornerstones of any relationship.